Hello. A paper says stress predicts poor academic performance. That sounds clear, but pause just for a moment and ask, what is stress in this study? A feeling, a hormone, a life circumstance, a thought pattern, a week of deadlines, a year of financial insecurity? And then the real question, how did they measure it? If stress is 5 self-report items about worry and sleep, then the result might be true. But it's a result about that measure, not necessarily about stress as we use the word in everyday life. This problem, the gap between what we claim to study and what we actually measure, runs underneath everything we've discussed so far. In weeks 1 and 2, we asked what makes a claim scientific and what it takes to support causal inference. But all of that rests on a quieter assumption that we already know what we're measuring. Week 3 asks a more basic question. Do we? Because here's the uncomfortable truth. In psychology, measurement is never just a technical step. It's a theoretical claim. By the end of this video, I want that sentence to make complete sense to you. Psychology studies things that are often not directly observable. We study emotions, attitudes, motivation, prejudice, anxiety, self-control, intelligence, well-being. You can't put self-esteem in a test tube. You can't weigh anxiety. You can't point to motivation the way you can point to a chair. These are constructs. A construct is a theoretical concept we use to explain patterns in behavior, experience, and mental processes. And here's the key idea of the whole video. A construct is not the same thing as a measure. The construct exists at the level of theory. The measure exists at the level of data. Your measure is not the thing, it is your window into the thing. And windows can distort. That gap between the invisible thing you care about and the observable numbers you collect is where measurement problems live. So week 3 is about learning to see that gap clearly and learning what it takes to justify crossing it. So what do psychologists do in this case? Well, they operationalize. Operationalization is the process of turning an abstract construct into something observable and measurable in a specific study. It sounds straightforward, but it forces decisions that are not purely technical. Let's take depression. How could you operationalize depression? You could use a clinical interview, a trained assessor asking structured diagnostic questions. You could use a questionnaire like the PHQ-9 or the BDI, asking people to rate their own symptoms over the past 2 weeks. You could measure cortisol, a stress hormone that's linked to depressive states. You could track sleep disruption, duration, quality, fragmentation across nights. All of these might relate to depression, but obviously they're not the same thing. Someone might score high on a questionnaire but not meet diagnostic criteria. Someone might have high cortisol but report no depressed mood. Someone might sleep poorly for reasons entirely unrelated to depression. This is the operationalization challenge. There is rarely a single, unique, correct measure of a construct. Different operationalizations capture different aspects. They produce different findings. They generalize differently. They come with different biases. So when you read a study, one of your first questions should always be, how exactly did they operationalize the construct? Because every claim is narrower than it sounds. Even stress predicts grades actually means this operationalization of stress in this population predicts this operationalization of academic performance. That's not cynical, that's precision. Let's make this concrete with a construct everyone thinks they understand: happiness. How could you measure happiness? Well, you could ask global life satisfaction, like overall, how satisfied are you with your life? You could sample momentary moods, like how do you feel right now? And repeat that across the day, like using a phone app. You could measure what's called eudaimonic well-being. That's meaning and purpose and sense of flourishing. These all sound like reasonable windows into happiness, but here's what makes this more than an academic distinction. These measures don't just produce different results, they sometimes produce opposite ones. Consider research on parenthood. Moment-to-moment mood sampling consistently shows that caring for children is among the least enjoyable daily activities, more stressful than commuting, housework, even doing the dishes. But ask people to rate global life satisfaction, and parents consistently score higher than non-parents. So, does having children make you happier? The answer then depends entirely on what you mean by happiness and what your measure captures. This is the gap again. The construct, the measure. And notice, the problem here isn't that one measure is wrong and the other is right. Both might be capturing something real. The issue is that happiness is doing too much work. It's a single word covering experiences that can genuinely pull in opposite directions. Which is exactly why measurement choices are theoretical choices. Now we need two concepts that students often confuse: reliability and validity. Let's start with reliability. Reliability means consistency. If the underlying thing hasn't changed, your measure should give similar results. A bathroom scale that gives you wildly different numbers from one moment to the next is unreliable. A questionnaire can be unreliable too. Maybe the items are vague. Maybe people interpret them inconsistently. Maybe the context changes responses dramatically. If your measure is unreliable, you have a basic problem. Noise obscures signal. Real relationships get hidden. Random fluctuations look meaningful. So reliability is a minimum requirement. But, and this is the punchline, reliability is not the same as validity. A measure can be perfectly reliable and still measure the wrong thing. I could measure your shoe size with perfect consistency every single time. That does not make shoe size a valid measure of intelligence. Reliability is consistency. Validity is whether you're measuring what you claim. Reliability is necessary, but it's never sufficient. Here's a quick check. A researcher measures anxiety using the same 5 items every week for a month. The scores are nearly identical each time. Is that evidence the measure is valid? No. It tells you the measure is reliable, that it's giving consistent readings. Whether those readings actually reflect anxiety rather than something else, like general negative mood or a response style, is a separate question entirely. Now, validity. Validity is the evidence-based claim that a measure actually captures the construct it's intended to capture, rather than something else. And here's why this is hard. Because constructs are not directly observable. You cannot check your measure against the construct itself the way you can check a ruler against a standard meter. There's no ground truth to compare against. Instead, validity is built through argument and evidence. A measure is valid if it behaves the way your theory says the construct should behave. That's the logic behind what psychologists call construct validity. And you can think of it as 3 big questions. First, does it converge where it should? If 2 measures claim to capture the same construct, do they relate meaningfully to each other? If your anxiety scale and a clinical anxiety interview are completely unrelated, something is wrong. Does it discriminate where it should? Does your measure avoid collapsing into other constructs? An anxiety measure that is basically identical to a depression measure isn't doing anything useful. It's not telling you which construct is actually at play. Third, does it respond to the right kinds of changes? If your theory says anxiety rises under threat, does your measure actually rise under threat? If people facing a stressful exam score the same as people relaxing at home, the measure isn't sensitive to what the construct is supposed to explain. Notice what's happening here. We're not just evaluating a questionnaire. We're evaluating the entire bridge between theory and data. So validity is not a sticker you attach to a scale. Validity is an ongoing case you build, and it's always provisional. This brings us to a sentence you'll see constantly in research papers. We use a validated scale. Sometimes that means something strong. Sometimes it means almost nothing, because validated is not a universal property. A scale might work well in one population, but not another. In one culture, but not another. For measuring stable traits, but not momentary states. In clinical samples, but not in everyday populations. And sometimes scales become popular for reasons other than quality. They're convenient, they're familiar, everyone else uses them. So train a new reflex. When you see the phrase validated scale, mentally add the missing question. Validated for what purpose, in what population, in what context, and with what evidence? This isn't cynicism, it's what scientific seriousness looks like. Now, for a final complication that exposes just how deep the measurement problem goes. Take self-control. You might measure it with a self-report scale, a delay of gratification task, a response inhibition task like the Stroop, informant ratings from people who know the participant, behavioral indicators like study time or exercise frequency. If self-control were a single unified capacity, these measures should align strongly. Often they don't. That forces an uncomfortable possibility. Maybe we've been using one label, self-control, for a family of related but distinct capacities. So when a study claims self-control predicts success, the more honest translation may be, this operationalization of self-control predicts this outcome in this context. And this connects to something you may have heard about, the replication crisis. When two labs study self-control and get different results, the instinct is to ask who made the error, but sometimes neither did. They used different operationalizations, different windows, different distortions, and found different things about constructs that share a name, but not necessarily a nature. Different windows, different distortions, different constructs hiding under the same word. You might have walked into this course assuming measurement was the boring administrative part of research, the bit before the real science begins. This video is trying to convince you it is the science. In psychology, measurement is theory. The moment you choose how to measure a construct, you are making a theoretical claim about what that construct is and how it shows up in observable indicators. Every scale, every task, every coded behavior is a position on a theoretical question. So the gap between construct and measure is never zero, and it never disappears just because a scale is published or widely used. The practical skill you're developing is this. Not just what did the study find, but what did it actually measure, and does that match what it claims to be about? If you develop that habit, you will instantly become harder to mislead by headlines, by graphs, and sometimes even by published papers. In the next video, we'll go straight to a modern diagnosis of what goes wrong in psychological measurement and what good measurement practice actually requires. We'll use Flake and her colleagues' framework to talk about measurement choices that are arbitrary rather than principled. And we'll introduce two ideas you'll start seeing everywhere once you know them. The jingle fallacy, where different things have the same name, and the jangle fallacy, where the same thing may have different names. So if week 3A gave you the foundational problem, week 3B, the next lecture, gives you the toolkit to spot it in real research. I'll see you there. Bye.